and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. When it comes to climate and environmental threats, nitrous oxide is in something of a league of its own. We've been aware of the harm caused by the planet's nitrous oxide emissions for decades, but it's only recently become a focus of serious attention, despite its negative impacts on the climate, the Earth's ozone layer, and human health. I'm Paul Newman, AIA's Senior Press and Communications Officer, and joining me today is climate campaigner Tom Nickson, who heads up our nitrous oxide campaign. Tom, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Now, to get the ball rolling, would you give us a bit of historical context about nitrogen? Simply put, what is it and what do we use it for?
Yeah, of course. So nitrogen is itself a vital element. It's found in soil, it's found in food, it's in our DNA. It's essential for all life on Earth. In fact, it's the most abundant element in the atmosphere. It makes up about 78% of the air that we breathe. Importantly, it helps to make croplands fertile. It's a key component in proteins. So it helps all living organisms to grow. But most living things can't use nitrogen in its pure atmospheric form. It's got to be chemically bonded to other elements to become usable or to become reactive. We call it reactive nitrogen. And for most of history, that process, it's called nitrogen fixation. It's happened naturally. It's happened through bacteria in the soil, in the water, in the roots of plants like beans and peas, different legumes. And that's a core part of the nitrogen cycle. So it allows living things to access this reactive nitrogen. And then eventually when they die and when they excrete waste, they return it back to the natural cycle. About a century ago, though, we had the development of the Haber-Bosch process. So what that did was it allowed humans to artificially convert nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia. And that breakthrough allowed for the industrial production of nitrogen fertilizers. And that's what has allowed us to hugely increase our food production globally over the last century, and is what supports such a large human population on Earth today. But while nitrogen is essential, excessive reactive nitrogen in its various forms is a major pollution issue. It pollutes water, it pollutes air, it degrades soil, it causes algal blooms, is a term you might have heard of. They're kind of dead zones in the water, in the sea. And annually, about 80% of the reactive nitrogen that we apply is lost, about 200 million tons of it. In particular, EIA focuses on just one form of reactive nitrogen pollution, which is nitrous oxide, or N2O, which is both a potent greenhouse gas and an ozone-depleting substance.
Nitrous oxide, this is the same substance that used to be referred to as NOS a few years ago, and you would find the little silver canisters laying in gutters in most towns around the country. It's basically laughing gas, is that right?
Yep, that's the same thing. It's laughing gas. It's also used, as a medical anesthesia, particularly in kind of dental care. But you also find it sold in balloons at music festivals.
That's my cue to walk in and say it's no laughing matter despite that. So what are the main impacts of nitrous oxide on the planet and its inhabitants? I mean, what does this actually do to us?
Well, it's a bit of a triple threat, really, nitrous oxide. In many ways, you can say it's a true super pollutant because it's got climate impacts, it's got ozone impacts, and it also has direct human health impacts. It's about 270 or so times more powerful than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, but it's often overlooked in climate conversations, even though it has actually accounted for about 10% of the global warming that we've experienced so far. In terms of ozone depletion, it's the single biggest threat to the ozone layer, which is the thin layer in the atmosphere that's protecting us from harmful UV radiation. And unlike past ozone-depleting substances that are controlled by a treaty called the Montreal Protocol, N2O doesn't concentrate. So N2O emissions aren't ultimately going to give us a hole in the ozone layer, like we talked about a lot in the 80s and 90s. N2O depletes ozone across all latitudes. So actually, it's the really populated parts of the planet that will experience a much higher risk from increased UV exposure as N2O depletes the ozone layer. And that has direct human health impacts. Increased UV radiation means higher rates of cataracts. It means higher rates of skin cancer. Some of the most recent estimates suggest that if we don't control our N2O emissions, they continue to increase. That could lead to about a 10% increase in skin cancer rates over this century. And then there's also co-pollutants that are emitted with N2O, mostly ammonia and NOx, and they're air pollutants that cause millions of premature deaths every year.
Okay. And what are the main sources of nitrous oxide emissions? Where would you typically find them coming from?
Well, the single biggest culprit is agriculture. About 75% of all of the human-caused nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture. And the main source really is the over-application of fertilizers, particularly synthetic fertilizers, so man-made fertilizers, to crops, to soils, to plants. What that's done is basically overloaded the natural nitrogen cycle. It's really radically disrupted it from its previously balanced state. And that has supercharged emissions of N2O as well as other forms of nitrogen pollution. Manure management in agriculture is also another source, so how we store and how we treat animal waste. But that still leaves 25% of N2O emissions, which are not related to agriculture. One of the main sources the EIA focuses on is industrial emissions. And by that, we're usually talking about chemical industrial emissions. So there's in particular two chemical processes that have nitrous oxide as a byproduct. There's adipic acid production and nitric acid production. And together they account for about 5% of the total emissions. Adipic acid is used to make nylon, particularly the kinds of heavy-duty nylons like car seatbelts, that sort of thing. And nitric acid is used actually to produce fertilizers, which then go on to have this follow-up impact in their over-application. It's also used to produce explosives. Those industrial emissions, they're often considered the low-hanging fruit for N2O mitigation because they could essentially be eliminated. We have existing proven technologies that can abate those emissions. And really, they cost as little as a few dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent for abating them. So together, that's 80% or so if we take agriculture and industrial. And that leaves you with the remaining 20%. And that can be attributed to fossil fuel combustion releases nitrous oxide emissions, wastewater treatment, so how we treat our sewage, aquaculture, so fish farming, for example, and then also biomass burning. That makes up the remaining kind of 20%. Biomass burning being like, burning off cropland after it's been gone through a growing cycle, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you referred to it as a low-hanging fruit of things we can actually address. Does that mean that there are simple replacements? Obviously, taking it out of production and the applications we can't use it for is one thing, but are there readily available replacements for it in those processes?
Yeah, well, the beauty of it is that it's a byproduct. So it's not a necessary part of any of those production processes. It's kind of what's left over. It's something that's emitted because we're not doing anything about it. So there's actually abatement technologies that you can install into those facilities. And some of them are catalytic, a bit like if catalytic converters in a car exhaust that makes some of the gases that come out less harmful, operates in a similar way. Or you basically capture and destroy the gas. But you can install these technologies in all of our existing facilities and plants that make these different acids. Don't have to reduce production, don't have to change the process that's used for production. You just need to deal with the byproduct.
So just capturing the waste and then making sure it doesn't get out into the atmosphere. Yeah?
Effectively, yeah.
Okay, and looking ahead, if we fail to take proper action to curb nitrous oxide emissions, what do you anticipate the long-term effects of that would be?
Well, let's start with climate change. If emissions do keep rising, that's predicted that it could add about an extra 0.2 degrees of warming to our already increasing temperature by 2100. And that will make it harder, if not impossible, to meet the Paris Agreement's goals. So you remember that the Paris Agreement, which was agreed 10 years ago, actually this year, has an aim of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and no more than 2 degrees. We're actually already at 1.25. We're pretty close to that. And 2024 was the first individual year that surpassed 1.5 degrees as a calendar year. So in that context, 0.2 degrees, although it doesn't sound a lot, is pretty substantial. And it could be the difference between achieving those goals or not achieving them. And that's not a kind of future problem because N2O emissions are already rapidly increasing. Since 1980, they've gone up by about 40%, and they're still climbing. And compounding that problem, N2O has a long atmospheric lifetime. It lives in the atmosphere for about 120 years. So its warming effects just keep building up the more and more that we emit it. If we turn to ozone layer depletion, if we don't curb our N2O emissions, we risk reversing decades of progress under the Montreal Protocol, which has been this very successful environmental treaty that we signed in the 1980s to phase out ozone depleting substances gradually, and which has started to lead to ozone recovery. But N2O is now the most significant ozone depleting substance. Its emissions are still rising, and by the end of the century, ozone levels could drop to their lowest point ever, exposing billions of people to higher UV radiation even than during the peak period of ozone depletion previously in the 1990s. And as I mentioned previously, that doesn't mean just limiting ozone depletion to the poles. It won't just be another ozone hole. It's across all the latitudes, in particular where people live. One of the other impacts of increased UV radiation is that plants and soils have their ability to act as a carbon sink undermined. So all of the reliance that we have on trees and other plants to soak up that carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere, it can do that much less effectively if there's increased UV radiation. So there's a kind of dual impact there. If we're talking then about human health, I already mentioned it could lead to an increase of about 10% in skin cancer rates. It could lead to an increase in cataracts rates. But it's not just about UV. There's those co-pollutants that I mentioned earlier as well. And some of the studies that have come out recently have suggested that we could avoid about 20 million premature deaths globally from air pollution related to N2O's co-products if we took action on N2O. Really, the cost of action is pretty staggering. And N2O is one of those things where, because of its massive impacts in different areas, for every dollar you put into trying to abate it and trying to reduce our emissions of it, you get a lot back for that buck.
It rather begs the question, though, if we known about the problems of nitrous oxide for so long, and particularly their potential long-term impacts, why are we only just now getting around to tackling it?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And we have known about N2O as an environmental problem for decades. Climate action, over the last few decades has focused almost exclusively on CO2 and more recently on methane. They're the kind of big two greenhouse gases. And nitrous oxide, whilst incredibly potent, it's just not gotten the same attention. Partly that's an awareness issue. It's not an easy problem with just kind of a one-stop answer. And it is so intrinsically bound up to the nitrogen cycle, which is this natural process, which has lots of different inputs and lots of different external effects. But you're right, scientists have known about its danger for decades, and public and political awareness has lagged long behind that. It's only really in the last few years, with reports like the UNEP FAO Global Nitrous Oxide Assessment in 2024, that the issue has started to try and gain some traction. One of the reasons, if we're honest, for this is that agriculture is a dominant source. And agriculture is a very difficult sector for policymakers to deal with. Farming has always had strong lobbies. If your threat as a lobbying group is, I can take away the food, that's pretty powerful. And nobody wants to do something that's going to undermine their nation's agriculture and their farmers. It's politically unpopular, and it's also, potentially risky if you're going to undermine your food security. I've already said, since we developed this ability to create industrial fertilizers, that's really become a cornerstone of the modern agricultural system. And so governments and industry groups have been really hesitant to regulate fertilizers in any way, partly due to those fears around food security, partly due to fears around economic impacts. But the irony is that better practices and a kind of smarter use of fertilizers would actually strengthen food security hugely while protecting the planet at the same time. At the moment, industrial fertilizer production is reliant very heavily on fossil fuels and on global fossil fuel supply chains. And so, for example, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, we saw a huge spike in fertilizer prices linked to the kind of spike in the price of natural gas. If you can wean your country's agricultural system off a complete reliance on synthetic fertilizers, because most countries, particularly in the West and in the global North, are over-applying fertilizers versus what they get back. If you can wean yourself off doing that, you actually end up with a much more resilient farming system, which is not reliant on those global supply chains in the same way. And we already have a lot of the tools to reduce agricultural emissions of N2O. We could reduce them by about 40% over the next decade. Sorry, not decade. Over the next, by the end of the century. Without threatening any food production. So it's not a delay that's about feasibility. It's about political will to act. And I guess that kind of brings us to another reason that there's not been action, and it's fragmented responsibility. So nitrogen pollution as a broader issue, not just N2O, is nebulous. There are lots of different sources. There are lots of different effects of it. And it's not easily covered by, for example, one international treaty. It's sort of fallen between the cracks of environmental policy making. So what we really need to think about now is how do we pull it out of those cracks, and where do we give it a home to start acting on it, either domestically or internationally, and both.
Yeah, I suppose it's about deciding who's on point and who's going to lead the charge effectively, and then coordinate a response.
Yeah.
I mentioned at the outset that you're heading up our EIA's nitrous oxide campaign. Can you tell us a bit about the campaign and what its main focus is at this stage?
Yeah, of course. So I would describe the N2O campaign as being dual track, where we're taking a kind of initial and very heavy focus on those industrial emissions that I spoke about earlier from adipic and nitric acid production, and then considering the bulk of the N2O emissions, so agriculture and as well as the other sources that we discussed earlier. There we're looking at an approach that centres more around national action plans and tailoring responses regionally and nationally. But the big focus of what we've been doing so far has been zeroing in on industrial sources of nitrous oxide. So they're among, basically, like I said earlier, the low-hanging fruit, the most addressable sources. And what we're pushing for is for the Montreal Protocol, for the ozone treaty, to step up and look at how it could control those industrial emissions. Now, we're looking at the Montreal Protocol for a few reasons. Firstly, it is the ozone treaty, and nitrous oxide is the single biggest ozone threat. So to our mind, it's a huge oversight that it's never actually taken action to address nitrous oxide to this point. But what the Montreal Protocol is very good at is dealing with chemical processes. It basically, throughout its existence so far, has primarily dealt with fluorinated chemicals that are man-made chemicals. And it's got around the issue of how do we actually control these things by placing the controls on production and consumption of those substances. Now, for N2O, it's a little bit more complicated because it's not something that we're deliberately producing to use for kind of explicit purposes. Often it's just a byproduct. Either it's a byproduct from the industrial process or it's a byproduct from over-applying fertilizer. But under the Montreal Protocol, there is actually precedent that we can use to look at industrial emissions. So in 2016, there was an agreement called the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And the big headline is that brought in a new class of chemicals to the treaty, hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. But part of that agreement, it also included a new requirement on parties to the treaty, that whenever they're producing fluorochemicals, if they create byproduct emissions of this very potent greenhouse gas called HFC-23, they have to capture them and destroy them to the extent practical. You could essentially apply that same logic to the processes where nitrous oxide is a byproduct emission. We have these chemical industrial processes with an ozone depleting byproduct, and we can use the Montreal Protocol to try and address that. Particularly its multilateral fund, so that developing countries are given a source of funding to actually implement projects that will help them go for that abatement. And that is already happening bilaterally, for example. So Germany is working with some other countries around the world to help them address nitric acid N2O emissions. But we want to see that as a model that's kind of carried out under the protocol. On the other side of the track, we're partly just trying to put the issue of N2O on the map. We've been working under different forums like UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, under this group called the UNEP Nitrogen Working Group, and with other kind of stakeholder networks, so the International Nitrogen Network, the International Nitrogen Initiative, to try and raise the policy profile of nitrous oxide, make greater awareness of the fact that there are solutions available, and then going to the people who can make that difference and explaining to them why it needs to be done, what needs to be done, and how it can be funded.
Excellent. And one final point. Ultimately, what action do you want to see the world take in response, not just to the work we're doing, but to the overall threat from nitrous oxide?
Well, I mean, the first thing would be to take it seriously. It's we're talking about a gas here that's been sometimes called the forgotten greenhouse gas, and we can't afford for it to remain the forgotten greenhouse gas. It's threatening climate, it's threatening ozone, it's threatening our health, but we're not seeing it yet reflected in any policy seriously. And what we really need to see, in particular to get to agricultural emissions, which are this very significant source, is for countries to take responsibility for national action plans that actually set out where their emissions are coming from, how they can mitigate them, and then they can develop and co-produce policy with key stakeholders, including farmers, the best kind of way that they can implement solutions.
Are there alternatives available to agriculture? I mean, obviously, you said at the outset, we've become increasingly reliant on fertilizers based on this to keep productivity up because there's so many of us now and we're all hungry. What would farmers be able to do to replace it? What alternatives are there that would be credible?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of alternatives, the alternative to synthetic fertilizers is manure, which has been the main fertilizer for most of human history. But the important point to stress is that we're not advocating for a complete removal of synthetic fertilizers. We're not saying that fertilizers are a bad thing, that they shouldn't exist. In fact, there are certain regions of the world where soils are completely nitrogen deficient and fertilizers need to be increased. In particular, places like sub-Saharan Africa that can't support their own populations because of the nitrogen levels in their soils at the moment. So it's not about getting rid of fertilizer, it's about using it properly. So precision application of fertilizer, only using it where it's needed to the extent that it's needed to actually produce the crop that's trying to be produced. And having practices in place, some of which can be really simple, to ensure that things like nitrogen runoff, so where fertilizer is over-applied and it leaches out into the soils, doesn't end up in our waterways and then doesn't contribute to this overloading of the nitrogen cycle. So things like just having strips of land that are left fallow between fields that are fertilized and waterways helps to reduce these emissions and other forms of nitrogen pollution. So a transition in part to natural alternatives, to manures, a reduction in fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers in particular, where they're being overused, and then cleverer ways that we can implement agricultural solutions themselves, including things like buffer strips, including things like crop rotation and planting cover crops.
Excellent stuff. Well, thank you very much, Tom. That's been really informative, and thanks for taking the time to join us today.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
I'll have you back. You can give us an update on the campaign in a few months' time, perhaps.
Fingers crossed.
Now, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes and check out our website at aia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thanks for joining us, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.